It's story time. The story begins. Let the words enter your mind. Neurons fire away deep into Imagination Central. There, any adventure can play out. Waves of blooming wildflowers roll in the summer breeze. Butterflies flutter across the field, drifting up into the sky. You build a Persian palace from shadowy memories. Inside, sitting on his ottoman in flowing silk robes, a sultan speaks to his emissary, his eyes drawn thin as he issues a challenge to his people to bring him a riddle he cannot solve. You enter Storyland. Now your heightened focus turns to today's storyteller.
My name is John Shetter. I am a Spellbinder storyteller with the library program here in Longmont, and I've been doing that for about 2.5 years. When I started out, I picked the name Johnny Teller because I thought that fit well with my name and what I enjoyed doing. The story I'm going to tell today is called Under the Eagle. The story is partly based on a book by the same name that was written by Robert S. McPherson. In 1924, a boy was born to a Navajo woman about 5 miles from Goulding, Utah, which is out in the middle of nowhere. It is close to what the Navajos call Eagle Mesa and Eagle Rock. Now, today, this is a place that is well visited because it is in the Monument Valley, very close to the borderline of Arizona and Utah. The name given to the little boy was Awi Joni, which in Navajo means beautiful baby. And that was the name he kept for quite a few years. Now, when beautiful baby was 4 years old, he was put in charge of helping his older sister, who was about 4 years older than he was, in charge of taking care of the flock of sheep and goats that the family had. There was also a younger brother who was a year younger than beautiful baby. One of the things that was difficult for the family, the father left when beautiful baby was only 2 years old. However, the mother kept this flock of sheep and goats, and they also had a couple of horses. Now, the mother would ride one of the horses once a month or so to the place in Goulding where she could get groceries. However, the primary diet of this family was mutton, goat's milk, and cornmeal. It was a difficult time for the family. However, they were very traditional. The mother particularly was a very traditional Navajo woman. She made these two kids, Awizoni and his sister, get up every morning and exercise and run. So the sister would run about a mile and he would have to run about a half a mile. Then, when the first snow fell in the wintertime, they were required to take off their clothes, go out and roll in the snow for a few minutes, and then come back in and get in a blanket. However, they could not get close to the stove. The mother believed that this would make them tough and they would be ready to face their enemies. Because in the Navajo tradition, and as I said, the mother was very traditional. She had been taught by her parents and grandparents, you need to be ready when the enemy is coming, because they will come. Well, as time went on, the mother would even take that younger son and go many miles away to visit relatives. She would be gone sometimes for 2 months. So beautiful baby and his sister were in charge of taking care of the flock of sheep and goats and taking care of themselves. Well, when he was about 12 years old, his mother married a man by the name of Ted Yellow, and they moved outside of a town in Arizona called Kayenta, which is still out in the middle of nowhere. At 13 years old, this young man found out that he had an older brother that he did not even know about. The older brother had moved away with the father when the father left the family. Well, the brother is the one who actually gave him a name. His name was Samuel Tom Holliday. The father was Billy Holliday, and he was a Navajo medicine man. Here's something else that you'll find hard to believe. Samuel did not have his hair cut until he was 13 years old. Can you imagine how long it was? However, again in the Navajo tradition, the men would make a bun of their hair in the back of their head. This 13th year turned out to be a very, very serious one for Samuel. Later in the summer, when he was 13, he was out herding the sheep and goats, and it was really, really hot. He came upon a place at Laguna Creek where there was a waterfall that had created a fairly good-sized pond that was deep. So Samuel took off all his clothes and dove into this pond. Unfortunately, there was a big rock there he had not seen, and he hit his knee on that rock. And when he looked, it was bleeding really bad, and he could actually see the bone on the part of his knee. He was able to get back home before he passed out. However, he did end up in the hospital for 3 months. Now, there turned out to be something good about that. as he was getting to feel better, there was a school at this hospital. And he began going to the school and learned his ABCs. Up to this point in time, Samuel spoke no English. He only spoke Navajo. Another thing took place while he was 13 years old. During this time, which was in the late 1930s, the federal government would send people out into the Indian reservations. And these people would force Native American kids to go to boarding schools. Now, a boarding school, in case you don't know, is a place where you live. You don't go home every night after school. You live there, and then you go to school during the day. You can go home in the summer times. Samuel was forced to go to a boarding school in Tuba City, Arizona, which was about 75 miles from his home in Kayenta. And in those times, that road was dirt, and it took hours to get back and forth between Kayenta and Tuba City. Well, after 4 years, Samuel graduated from boarding school and finished the 7th grade. The good thing was, however, he was now fluent in English. This was in the summer of 1941, so Samuel went out and got a job. And he was working when on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States was drawn into the Second World War. Samuel went to the recruiting depot and signed up to serve his country. In the summer of 1942, when he turned 18, he received a letter and he reported to Phoenix, Arizona for his physical and his induction into the United States Marine Corps. And he was sent to San Diego, California to go to boot camp. I'm going to go away from Samuel for just a moment. The United States had been in the war now for several months, and the Marines had people who were fighting the Japanese. The Japanese had a lot of people in this country who were going to colleges and who knew about the culture and the ways of the United States before the war started, and they had gone back to Japan. So when the Marines would send radio messages from one unit to the other, oftentimes the Japanese, even though the messages were encoded, were able to find out what those messages meant, what they said. Well, there was a gentleman in the Marine Corps named Philip Johnston. His family and he had lived with the Navajos for several years before everything started. And so he went to Marine commanders and said, why don't we get Navajo men to speak in their language and the Japanese will not be able to understand that? So 29 Navajo men were recruited. Samuel was not one of those. And they, along with other Marines, developed a code of 600 words. For example, the Navajo word for hummingbird meant fighter plane. The Navajo word for whale meant battleship. And the Navajo word for eggs meant bombs. And so these Navajo code talkers were able to transmit messages in their language that the Japanese could not figure out what they were saying. All right, back to Samuel. Samuel went after boot camp to Camp Pendleton in California, where he became a code talker. He memorized the 600 words. He was sent to islands in the South Pacific Ocean with the Marine Corps. The first small boat that he was in that went ashore was turned over by an explosion in the water, and he nearly drowned because of the heavy radio equipment that he was carrying. Now, let me tell you how these code talkers worked. There would be 2 or 4 of these code talkers with radios on a ship off of one of the islands, or they'd be at headquarters on an island where the Marines had found a base. There would be 2 to 4 code talkers who were on the battle lines, on the front line with the Marines who were fighting. And these men on the front lines would send encoded messages back to the ship or to the headquarters and ask for air support, or they would ask for artillery to be fired so that they could even give coordinates as to where that artillery should land. And they would do that in the Navajo language, and it worked. The Japanese were not able to disencode these messages. Now, Samuel fought on the islands of Saipan. He fought on the island of Tinian. And finally, he fought on the island of Iwo Jima. These were awful battles. The Japanese had taken over the islands to establish air bases and bases for ships, and the Marines and other military people were attempting to take these islands back. The Battle of Iwo Jima lasted from February 19th to March 26th of 1945. Samuel went ashore on Iwo Jima the first day, and he and other Marines were trapped in the single foxhole for 2 full days before the Marines were able to move inland enough that they could move out of that foxhole. He witnessed many terrible things, including the death of some of his fellow code talkers. All during these many battles, Samuel kept many traditional Navajo ways. One of the things that he did, he had a small bag that he hung around his neck on a necklace, and in it he kept traditional things like an arrowhead. He also kept corn pollen, and before going into battle, he would take a small amount of corn pollen he would put it on his forehead and a little bit on his tongue. And he believed that that would keep him safe. Those were some of the traditional things that he did as a Navajo during every battle. Samuel survived the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he returned to Kayenta. Times were not easy, however. He had difficulty with nightmares and remembering some of the terrible things that he saw in the battles in the war. He moved to some different places and tried to find himself, but it was difficult. And it was difficult for all of these code talkers who came back, partly because they were not able to say anything about the code or what they did for 23 years after the war. It was 1978 before they could talk about what they had done and about that code. Well, Samuel was able to get a job as a policeman in Tuba City, Arizona. And there he met Lupita Isaac. After a year or so, they were married, and they had many children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Lupita lived while they were married for 58 years. However, sadly then, she passed away. Samuel Tom Holliday, one of 410 Navajo code talkers who served this country. They have been honored in many, many ways. Believe it or not, Samuel Holliday to this day goes around the country giving presentations about what he did, what his life was during and after the war. On March 31st of this year, he gave a presentation at Stanford University. In June of 1916, he turned 92 years old. Samuel Tom Holliday, a wonderful man. I want to finish by telling you about Under the Eagle. As you probably know, on a lot of flagpoles where there is an American flag, on the top is an eagle, a representation of an eagle. In the Navajo tradition, the tie between Father Sky and Mother Earth is the eagle. So Mother Earth is under the eagle. I am so happy to tell this story about Samuel Tom Holliday. One of the difficult things for the code talkers after the war is that for 23 years, they were not allowed to talk about the code or what they did during the Second World War. It was not until 1968 that they were able to tell the story of what they did and what the code was. It was a real pleasure for me to learn and to tell this story. And I think it is good, particularly for the fifth graders that I tell stories to remember and find out and learn about some of the things that happened earlier in this country, particularly with the Native Americans, which I really enjoy telling both folk tales and true tales about Native Americans. The last thing I would like to say is that a relative of mine, my Aunt Jean, who is 86 years old, suggested to me, "Johnny, why don't you tell a story about the Navajo code talkers? I bet the kids would really enjoy that." So I was happy to put this story together, and I sent a copy to Aunt Jean, and she really enjoyed it. And I believe that the fifth graders also enjoyed the story.